Throughout human history, there may be nothing that has been more dangerous than a leader who cannot admit defeat. You've likely heard the stories. The heads of nations who, when faced with the consequences of their own disastrous decisions, refused to stop, refused to surrender, and instead, they doubled down. And then they doubled down again, and again, and again, until finally they had nothing left to double down with, and they ultimately still lost. This time with their entire nation having been destroyed in the process. This is exactly the situation Vladimir Putin now finds himself in today in his war against Ukraine. The type of world leader we're talking about is sort of like a gambler, and in fact, the psychology might be exactly the same. A gambler who goes to the table and quickly loses most of what they have. But because the pain of losing is so heavy and often disastrous for their life, instead of walking away with a locked-in loss that they might be able to eventually recover from, the gambler chooses to double down to chase the small chance of getting everything back again. And so they keep losing until they have absolutely nothing left. Psychology doesn't change just because someone becomes a world leader. You just might have access to more resources and more lives to destroy than just your own. And so world leaders who get caught in this trap often end up gambling everything. Their nation's savings, their people's lives, and their reputation around the globe that could help build their nation's future, all because the idea of admitting failure is simply unbearable to them. Unfortunately, this is not rare. In fact, this type of world leader is terrifyingly common, because the psychology that leads someone to aspire to be a world leader in a position of power in the first place is often the very same psychology that makes them incapable of willingly giving up or backing down. Throughout history, this has often caused humanity to remain locked in conflicts for far longer than necessary, and today is no exception with Russia's war against Ukraine, casting a chilling shadow over where this war could potentially go. Consider how terrible it could be, for example, if Vladimir Putin chose a path similar to that of the end of Adolf Hitler. For Hitler, of course, the writing of defeat was on the wall long before the actual defeat finally came. But instead of admitting defeat to preserve more of what was left of the German people, the Nazi leaders instead chose to double down, risking everything on a gamble that they were never going to win, even continuing to fight as Berlin was surrounded, and resorting to conscripting teenagers for a final and pointless last stand. Only after this last stand was in the process of being fully defeated did the Nazi leader finally decide to end the war by taking his own life, still unable to bear with the consequences of what he had done. With his final act, Hitler proved that facing his people or standing trial was simply never an option for a person like him. And as he took the coward's way out, he proved that if he had even only a fraction of a percent chance of success, he would have sacrificed everything Germany had, if only it meant the sliver of a possibility that he might avoid consequences and maintain his legacy. What is notable about this is that, for a lot of people, when they hear it, even though they know it's history, it doesn't actually feel like real human history. It feels like a story. And so when faced with the same type of people in our own era, humanity routinely underestimates what they're capable of, and humanity routinely underestimates the willingness of despotic leaders to push their people beyond the point that logically makes sense if they think there is even a chance of saving their own head, their own face, and their own legacy. These men did not get into power by caring about the people around them, so why people would think that they would suddenly begin factoring in other people's lives when it comes to the potential of them losing that same power is anybody's guess. And when it comes to today and Russia's war against Ukraine, the dark lessons of this psychology are especially relevant. The work behind today's episode was made possible by my sponsor, Incogni. There are a lot of unique problems that come with living in a modern world, and they often come back to the same root. I'm talking about things like scams, identity theft, online stalking, harassment, data breaches, and so many more. These all often start with your personal data being exposed across the internet. Not only are these details often leaked, they're actually actively bought and sold by people like data brokers, who can legally publish and profit from selling deeply personal information. This can include things like your name, personal address, and court records being sold to anyone, including employers, landlords, and random strangers. Thankfully, you do have a right to protect your privacy, and this is what Incogni helps with. Incogni can track down and remove your personal data from most sites all across the internet, and the process is fully automated and repeated so that your data doesn't reappear. But even better than that, Incogni's custom removal feature can take down almost everything that's exposed about you online. All you have to do is send them a link, and their dedicated privacy expert will handle everything else. And with their unlimited plan, you can submit as many links as you want. So choose Incogni to take back control of your personal data. All you need to do is create your account, authorize Incogni to remove your data, and they handle the rest. Incogni offers a risk-free 30-day money-back guarantee. So try it out, give it a shot, and get a full refund if you're not 100% satisfied. Just click the link in the description and use my code ICARUS to get 60% off an annual plan and get started today. There's a few simple facts about Russia's war against Ukraine that everyone needs to understand. First, Russia is taking extremely heavy losses and is not achieving its broader objectives by doing so. But second, despite this fact, Vladimir Putin has still shown no interest in peace negotiations, let alone in fully ending the conflict. Looking a little deeper, the only thing that Russia has achieved in their war against Ukraine is a massive 1 million Russian casualties, and the gains they have made in exchange for those high costs have been marginal at best, causing most analysts to openly wonder if it's even possible for Russia to actually win their war. Indeed, Russia now occupies less of Ukraine than they did in 2022, during the early stages of the full-scale invasion, and with each passing day, as Ukraine musters more support from Western partners and makes further drone advances that will allow them to exact far higher losses from the Russians at a far lower cost to themselves, this equation gets even more skewed in a direction that is not favorable to Russia. One would think that given these circumstances, Russia would take any opportunity possible to save face and declare any sort of victory they could muster. But despite this, when Vladimir Putin was recently offered to consider extremely generous peace terms by Donald Trump, peace terms that made most of the Western world angry at their extreme generosity towards Russia, Putin turned them down flat. These terms would have officially recognized Russian control of Crimea, as well as currently occupied portions of territories in eastern Ukraine, along with many other significant concessions, such as excluding Ukraine from joining NATO. Conceivably, the Russian propaganda machine could have spun this as a victory, at least a partial one. After all, it would have solved their main stated reason for starting the conflict in the first place. But Russia didn't even bite, or even act interested in considering the proposal at all. Sure, Vladimir Putin might have said he wanted to consider these peace terms with his words, but even as the words had barely left his lips, Russia consistently responded to these peace overtures by immediately ordering the largest aerial strikes of the entire war on Ukrainian cities, even purposely targeting civilians, apartment buildings, maternity hospitals, and playgrounds. These types of targets could serve limited strategic purposes in a traditional military sense. Targeting civilians doesn't reduce Ukraine's ability to fight Russian soldiers, but instead only instills in the Ukrainians a deeper will to fight and defeat Russia on the battlefield. And when Putin responds to peaceful gestures by bombing cities, it only provokes the Ukrainians to want to fight him longer and harder, the exact opposite of what you would do if you were genuinely pursuing a ceasefire. This brings to mind an uncomfortable truth, especially when one considers this in light of Russia's massive and unsustainable losses on the battlefield. Because what a lot of people have missed is that maybe provoking an endless war is actually the point. Vladimir Putin is, of course, operating on a different calculus than most of us. The calculus he's operating on is strictly selfish, a calculus that is strictly unwilling to admit to any kind of defeat, and therefore a calculus that might actually feel trapped in Russia's war against Ukraine, no matter the costs. For Vladimir Putin, ending his war seems like it will cost him more personally than continuing it does, and that is a very dangerous place to be. Together, those facts point towards a narrative that many people haven't yet even considered. Russia's primary goal may no longer be to actually win the war, but instead to simply keep it going at any cost. Because for Vladimir Putin personally, the fact that Russia is at war keeps him in power and keeps him in a place of comfort where he continues to feel and remain in control. As far as Putin's concerned, it's not over until he says it is, even if all hope has long since been lost. There's a lot of aspects leading to this conclusion other than mere psychological speculation. And a lot of it becomes clear when you look at the Russian economy and recognize the catch-22 that Vladimir Putin is really in. On one hand, he's in a lot of trouble if he continues his war against Ukraine. But on the other hand, in the short term, he may be in more trouble if he ends the war, especially without a definitive victory. A big aspect of why Russia is in so much trouble from this extended war is that the Russian economy, and therefore Russian industry, have increasingly been moved to a war footing, with the vast majority of high-paying jobs in Russia now coming either from military pay directly or indirectly from the high-paying jobs that Russians can get building arms for the Russian war machine. This was, in part, likely intentional, and part of the reason that Vladimir Putin has offered high wages to the people in these industries is to make the Russian people feel something positive in relation to the war. As a shrewd politician, Vladimir Putin of course knows that people care the most about what is happening to their wallets, and that people will overlook and justify all kinds of evil if they personally feel better off financially. But that can be a double-edged sword when that prosperity then goes away. In order to create this feeling of prosperity, Vladimir Putin has funneled money into the Russian economy through military jobs. But the calculus that he has to face is that if he ends the war against Ukraine, those jobs will ultimately be forced to go away, or at least to be reduced in capacity. His original plan seems to have been to try to avoid this unfortunate dilemma. When he ordered the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin had prepared by saving up a large war chest that could extend the feeling of prosperity long after the war had ended, or at least that's what he had hoped. His strategy seemed to be to deploy this war chest into the Russian economy after a victory in Ukraine, to make the Russian people feel like war is extremely profitable, then using the spoils of that war to help make up for the cost of deploying the war chest. But Vladimir Putin is now facing the unfortunate reality that in the fourth year of his war against Ukraine, he still hasn't won. And rather than being deployed into the Russian economy, the war chest has had to be used to fund an extended and expensive war. So there isn't much of it left to deploy. As a result, if the war in Ukraine ends today, Vladimir Putin will have nothing meaningful to give to the Russian people for all of their sacrifices. Instead, the war economy will wind down, and many Russians will lose their jobs and their incomes, making them feel like the war had actually ended in defeat economically. And they wouldn't be wrong. And so in the calculus of his mind, Putin is constantly weighing what is going to put more pressure on him from a domestic standpoint. Is it going to put more pressure on him to continue having this war ongoing? Or is it going to put more pressure on him for people's finances to get hurt? And most politicians know that people's finances getting hurt are the surest way to actually move people to activism, and perhaps even to oust them from power. So Vladimir Putin very well could feel trapped in the war against Ukraine, not seeing a good way out, and being forced to gamble and hope for a better outcome in terms of a victory, no matter how unlikely that victory might be, to try to make up for his losses. Now this is of course illogical, because as the war continues, the cost of the war will continue to increase. And ultimately, eventually, the Russian people will face financial catastrophe as a result of the war. For Vladimir Putin, his hope is that he can escape as much of that as possible. And it might not be a real hope. It might be a fool's hope, like the gambler who keeps doubling down every time he loses his money. But even more than this, there's another aspect of the war against Ukraine where Putin, in a similar fashion, is caught in a different catch-22. And this other aspect is the men within the Russian military. You know, the ones doing the actual fighting. It's of course well documented at this point via confessions by Russian soldiers, the brutality of the Russian military, and the deceptive, corrupt, and evil practices that Russian officers have used to put men on the front line to fight for Vladimir Putin. There are endless stories of people who were recruited to go to one place in Russia that was supposed to be far away from the front line, who instead ended up on the front line anyways, and with little training, having been deceived into going there. There are also endless stories of abuse, of officers extorting their soldiers, stealing from them, with the punishment being that if they don't do what the officer wants, they just go to the front line, where they are ordered to join a hopeless assault mission and are ultimately eliminated. This is just a small taste. We could list off examples for hours and hours, but there's no need. You can find other videos doing that, including the direct confessions from the Russian soldiers themselves. The point is, if you're a leader like Vladimir Putin, and you're thinking through the crude calculus of all of this, one question that you are probably constantly asking yourself is what happens to me when all of these soldiers come home, especially if they come home in defeat, and they went through all of this hell and all of this pain, and did not even get anything for it, or even achieve anything for their country in the process. What you would have in this circumstance is a lot of men who are now well trained, who have experienced hardship, many of whom will have lost friends, and who might have nothing left to lose, coming back to a Russia whose economy will have been devastated by the war, an economy which can't use the spoils of Ukraine or the savings of the now depleted war chest to make up for that devastation. And for Vladimir Putin, that's a terrifying thought. In the long term, Vladimir Putin has to know that the more Russian soldiers he puts into the battlefield, the more will come home to feel that way, and the more that they will have the capability to move against him, work against him, and potentially even overthrow him. But in the short term, he might be thinking, if I just continue putting men into the battlefield and putting them in situations that are dangerous, maybe these angry men simply might not come home. And if they do come home, perhaps we will have achieved our goals. So maybe they will let me get away with using them in such terrible ways. And maybe for both of these reasons, I can kick the can down the road and prolong this a little bit longer. It is not a logical position to have. It is a desperate position to have. The position of somebody who is pushed against the wall, pushed into a corner with nowhere left to go. Vladimir Putin feels like he has to continue fighting, because even though he knows it's so bad for him, he fears in the short term what will happen if that ultimately stops. And this is very important to understand, because the Western world currently seems to be failing to appreciate the significance of this type of situation. Again, there are historical precedents. When we look at Adolf Hitler, we can, of course, say it wasn't logical for him to do all that he did in the last days of the war. It wasn't logical to keep pushing the German people. There was no chance that he was ever going to win. But to Hitler, it didn't matter. If there was 1% of 1% of a chance that he could be victorious, he was always going to continue pushing for that rather than admitting to defeat at any level. And this is the psychology of somebody who invades another country, which is exactly the kind of person who Vladimir Putin is. So given all of this, I don't believe the war in Ukraine will end soon. And it definitely won't completely end until Russia is actually defeated and Vladimir Putin is out of power. Vladimir Putin becoming ousted is probably the best possible result, because even though he will inevitably be replaced by somebody who probably is just as evil as him, at least that person won't be the person who started this war. And maybe they won't feel trapped by it anymore. That is the best possible outcome to get Russia to disengage from a war that they are actively losing, but that they're not willing to stop fighting, causing utter destruction, not just on Ukraine, but on themselves, and on the Russian people as well. Until that happens, I'll still be here creating videos and analyzing this war. So be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out my second channel for more regular video updates as well.